Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. To paraphrase John Maynard Keynes, I leave the Troika to gloat over the devastation of Europe. Okay, Stacey Herbert, what the frick are you talking about?
Well, he said that during the Treaty of Versailles when he quit. He stepped off the Treaty of Versailles negotiations because he realized that the Western powers, well, the UK, US, and France, were imposing upon Germany intolerable suffering. And he quit, saying this is going to lead to disaster. So I look around Europe today, and Germany is in the position where they could step away from imposing disaster upon Greece, and yet they refuse to. And IMF has betrayed its mission in Greece, captive to EMU creditors. The IMF's original sin in Greece was to let Dominic Strauss-Kahn hijack the institution to save Europe's banks and the euro when the crisis erupted, dooming Greece to disaster. So, you know, Greece just last week technically defaulted on a 300 million euro payment to the IMF. It's going to be bundled into a 1.6 billion euro one end of June.
Yeah, well, Greece it defaulted many weeks ago. They defaulted months ago, and Germany and the IMF and the EU, they want to take Greek assets. They want the deposits, they want all the income-producing assets, and the Greeks are saying, no, we don't want to give you these assets because, first of all, the debts were fraudulently induced. You mentioned the creation of the euro. Remember, Greece was the victim of a fraud perpetrated by Goldman Sachs and others, John Paulson, hedge fund manager, and they hoisted onto them illegally hundreds of billions of euros worth of debt, and as a result, the country has collapsed, but by design, because this is exactly where Germany wanted to be at this time. They wanted to be in a position to be negotiating with a failed state so that they can grab as many assets as they possibly can on the cheap. This is the Fourth Reich on the cheap. This is a cheap way to exercise imperial power in Europe. So in that way, it's not so bloody and gutty and messy at the moment, but I think it will get.
Well, yeah, so many say that Deutsche Bank would basically collapse if Greece, not necessarily just Greece, but if Greece collapses, then Spain and Italy, can they be far behind? But, you know, after World War I, of course, the victors were and angry that they had been bloody and violent and years of conflict, and you could forgive them for their ignorance, even though John Maynard Keynes had warned them that this would be, the inevitable outcome would be total disaster, and that it would be better, in fact, to have Germany become part of the economy, somebody to trade with rather than somebody to gloat over with vengeance. So you wonder where the vengeance is. It's like this is a financial war. The creditors feel like violent, victors. They feel like they have stomped on this debtor, and they will not let this debtor, get their boot off the face of this debtor.
Well, there's something very strategic in allowing Greece to hobble along as it is, because it keeps the euro cheaper than it would normally be if Greece were not part of the euro, and this is fantastic for German exports. So there's something very strategic in the Germans' vilification of Greece. And now, over the weekend, I don't know if you saw this, but the co-CEOs of Deutsche Bank have resigned.
Yeah, yes.
Because they realize that Deutsche Bank is about to go belly up. It's an insolvent institution that has $90 trillion worth of uncollateralized, unsecured derivatives contracts that they have off the balance sheet. But once, as we saw in 2008, the credit market seize up, suddenly those appear like ghosts out of the woodwork on the balance sheet of the global economy, and you have an enormous problem. So those guys have resigned because they know that very soon Deutsche Bank is about to go belly up. Greece is now going to engage in an uprising, the likes we haven't seen in Europe for quite some time, and the global economy is on the verge of seizing up once again.
Now, Greece's public debt to GDP is 180% of GDP. Now, just to put that into context, the UK, at the end of World War II, theirs was 220% of GDP. And yet, they went on a huge public spending binge, which is they created the NHS. They created the national railways. They did a lot of investment. And what happened? The economy boomed, because that's one of the ways you could resolve that debt to GDP issue. You can increase GDP, whereas these, aggressive creditors towards Greece are demanding austerity. And in this article in the Telegraph, Ambrose Evans Pritchard said, now all this austerity, this imposing the austerity, would be justifiable, sort of, if the other side of the usual IMF bargain were available, i.e. debt relief and devaluation. This is how IMF programs normally work: impose tough reforms, but also wipe the slate clean on debt and restore crippled countries to external viability. All of this went out the window in Greece. The IMF enforced brute liquidation without compensating stimulus or relief. It claimed that its policies would lead to a 2.6% contraction of GDP in 2010, followed by a brisk recovery.
Well, Evans Pritchard is somebody who believes in these institutions like the IMF as being chartered with the intention of providing some useful benefit to the global economy. He's a bit of he sees the world in rose-colored glasses in many ways. He doesn't want to admit that the IMF is a rapacious creditor, along with these big banks on Wall Street and the City of London. They targeted Greece for destruction, as they targeted Lehman Brothers, as they targeted Bear Stearns for destruction, and made people. How did Jamie Dimon become a billionaire? I mean, the J.P. Morgan is essentially a utility. It's like saying the guy who runs a local electric utility became a billionaire. There's only one way you can do that. That's by stealing energy and selling it on the black market. Jamie Dimon steals essentially derivatives and sells them on the black market, makes $1 billion. Part of that theft is to target a country like Greece, market for death, destroy it, grab those assets, like the IMF did many times in South America, Latin America. We've seen this movie before, so they've never done it in Europe before, and now they're doing it in America. Their minions are in places like Baltimore, or other areas, communities. J.P. Morgan, of course, famously in various states have bankrupted the state and stolen the pension assets, and so this is all part and parcel of the same scheme.
Actually, leaked minutes from the IMF meetings happening before the loan originally was given to Greece show that the emerging market members and Switzerland were really against the austerity measures to be imposed by the IMF in a result of this. And Ambrose Evans Pritchard says it loaded yet more debt onto the crushed shoulders of an already bankrupt country and further complicated the picture by allowing one large French bank and one German bank, no names please, to offload much of their 25 billion euros of combined exposure onto EMU taxpayers. And yet, over and over again, other than people who watch the Keiser Report, most people in Europe will blame the Greeks themselves. They won't blame that unnamed French bank and that unnamed German bank.
It's scapegoating.
Yeah.
And we've seen that before, famously in the 30s. But let's look at this revolving door concept. People are familiar with the revolving door concept. Like, people who work in the government will end up working for private banks, and then they'll work back in the government, or activists will work for Greenpeace, and they'll go into the government, they'll come back. This is a revolving door of debt. So the debts are on the EU's balance sheet, then they're on the Greek balance sheet, then they're on the IMF's balance sheet, then they're on the Deutsche Bank's balance sheet. And every time the debt goes through this revolving door, all the bankers get a fee. That's how Jamie Dimon and the banking class make billions of dollars, is by charging fees on the same parcel of debt that they pass around an infinite amount of times. It's called infinite rehypothecation here in London. That's the technical term for it. And it's selling the same debt innumerable times and taking a fee every single time. Now, the only way they get away with it is that they've had a 28-year bull market in bonds, which means that the yields have constantly gone down. You can repackage the same garbage over and over again and get away with it. But once that bull market is over in bonds, then it's game over. So
just like John Maynard Keynes proved prophetic with his warnings about what the Versailles Treaty would do, here in the 2010 leaked memos from the IMF, showed that here's the prophetic guy, and that is Arvind Virmani, India's member, was prophetic. He said, quote, "The scale of the fiscal reduction without any monetary policy offset is unprecedented. It is a mammoth burden that the economy could hardly bear," he said. "Even if arguably the program is successfully implemented, it could trigger a deflationary spiral of falling prices, falling employment, and falling fiscal revenues that could eventually undermine the program itself." This is exactly what happened.
That is exactly what happened, but it's not by accident, it's by design. They've been targeted for death because there's a huge amount of money to be made on making negative bets on a country like Greece, like we saw with Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and other, or even, the multi-level vitamin seller Herbalife was the victim of a huge short sale campaign by a large hedge fund manager. They're not that much bigger or smaller than Greece, the entire country. That's the problem when you have hedge fund managers with infinite availability to credit. They can target anything. Could be a country, could be a company. Doesn't
well,
matter.
that's okay, because let's look to a lot of people out there are not Greeks, and they think, well, what does it matter to me? Well, why the battle between Athens and Brussels matters to all of you. Of course, one of the things that Brussels, on behalf of the creditors, is demanding right now is that Greece impose 23% VAT on electricity and water and 11% on staple food. So these are your those Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those are your basic needs of living. But in this article from Alex Andro, he says the reason this matters to all is twofold. First, it forces out into the open and brings into sharp contrast the increasing divergence between the well-being of markets and the well-being of populations. Second, it marks a clear act of economic blackmail by a global de facto establishment, let's call it the Davos set, unhappy at a democratic people opting for an alternative to neoliberalism. How these tensions resolve themselves would determine whether national elections remain meaningful in any way, whether democratic change is possible, or violent revolution is in fact the only effective option.
First they came for the Greeks, then they came for the Italians, then they came for the British, then they came for me. Okay, this is what happens when you scapegoat a population, steal all their money, and start putting them into camps, and then exterminate them.
But this is also the end stage of capitalism, as would have been predicted by Marx. He predicted this financialization, and these contracts of this market fundamentalism. These contracts have become holy sort of scriptures, like elevated to these divine, unbreakable contracts with some sort of market god that you can't
it's
break.
market fundamentalism.
Yeah.
That's why I equate Jamie Dimon with ISIS, because they're both financial or theological terrorists. They misquote their texts upon which they draw their inspiration. They're willing to die for their cause or kill other people. We saw that in 9/11, which was both Saudis and bankers working together to fulfill theological fanaticism. So there's no difference between HSBC, Al-Qaeda, Barclays, ISIS. They're cut from the same exact cloth. Christy Lagarde is a terrorist. She's a financial terrorist. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. And until you realize that, Edward Pritchard, you're going to be writing dribbling nonsensical. Nobody reads this because you're not thinking like a real strategic person.
Okay, so going forward, after Greece, in a very calm way, after Greece comes Italy. After Italy comes Spain. After Spain comes Portugal. After Portugal comes France. After France comes the UK. After the UK comes the US. So these are the sort of conditions they're going to impose on you. Is 23% VAT. That's the beginning of what they're going to charge you for your basic needs like electricity and water. 11% on your food. They're going to, they're
Look,
gonna,
here's the solution.
Contracts.
You buy whatever company is in the business of making body bags. Buy into that company. Gotta go.
Ciao.
All right, well, stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Ross Ashcroft of Renegade Inc. That's Renegade Inc. Ross, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much. Always nice to be here. There's an element of the show that's always a bit social.
Brilliant!
Social hand grenade, I was going to say.
Yeah,
but
right.
I like that. I like the volatility.
Some of the British people actually spill their tea, which is incredible.
Here?
No, around the country when they watch it. They're like, oh, I love it. He said he's in the bank's insolvent. So let's get it down to you. Of course, the famous film that you've made, The Four Horsemen, you put it on YouTube. It's got how many millions of views?
It's just broken 3 million views.
Right, you're catching up to Psy, who I think has 2 billion.
Is that right?
For his horsey style.
But it's it's been stolen. We think about 5.5 million times. It's been downloaded. So lots of people have seen it, and then a lot of people now say, "What are you going to do next?" 5 horsemen.
Yeah.
No,
doesn't sound
5.
biblical, does it?
No. And 6 horsemen.
No.
No. So
that sounds like the Kentucky Derby.
So 7 horsemen. We could do this all day, right? What have you got for 7?
What is next? Is there another sequel to this?
No, what we've realised is that media consolidation across the world, and you know a lot about this, is a problem. So we're launching, it's not Renegade Economist any longer, it's Renegade Inc., and we're broadening that brand, and that's the next idea.
Right, so it's going to be...
And we're crowdfunding it, and this is a shameless plug. What we need to do is get behind Renegade Inc.
Well, we have another show we can do with this and really dig down deep into it. But you mentioned media consolidation, which is interesting. So you guys are media players in the financial media space, and you're saying it's consolidated. Totally. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at elections across the world, in Canada and Australia and Israel, all that right-wing media has had a massive effect. Australian press freedom is lowest in the Western world. It's incredible. And in this country, when you saw the Conservatives sweep to power, the way the right-wing press reported the financial aspect, or reported on the economy, was infantile. So our view is that media consolidation isn't giving people, the electorate, a fair crack of the whip. So instead of going out and doing another documentary or a big cinema doc, what we're going to do is launch an independent media platform which allows people to think differently about what's actually going on.
Okay, so the remit for Renegade Inc., as I understand it, you've got three pieces here. One's education, one is media, producing content, and the third is what?
Well, so what we're looking at is inform, illuminate, inspire. Really simple. So finance, entrepreneurship, because the way the world is going at the moment, work is changing for good and it's never going to come back, as we know. Secondly, education, illumination, and self-education is more accurate because look at the state of the education system in the West. It's a mess. It's a targets-driven mess. So what we need is objective education, which allows people to bring out the stuff that they have in them and display their talents. And lastly, the arts, because if you want to change anything, creativity is the driving force. So finance, business, education, the arts, illuminate, inspire, and inform, and that is the platform.
Right, so education, of course, is key, but this media issue that you bring up, what you call consolidation, you're also making an analogy, it's a right-wing kind of takeover.
Well, it is
more
really.
so than ever.
It's intellectual capture, if you like. And when we made Four Horsemen, Gillian Tett said brilliantly in it, this is all about the cognitive map. And what elites, I can't stand the phrase, but what the rent-seeking elite do brilliantly is leave stuff undebated, unsaid. And this really goes back to the Big Bang and Margaret Thatcher. This idea of Tina, there is no alternative. There are many, many alternatives. And at the moment, what we have is a media that sees the world through one prism. And what we have is a multi-dimensional, rich, rich world only reported in one way. And that simply isn't good enough. And as we see, and any venture capitalist in the world will tell you this now, that all they're looking at for backing is decentralization. Any business that looks and factors decentralization and can scale in that way. What we're going to see over the next business cycle is huge amounts of decentralization. What that gives opportunity for is an independent media platform which allows people to think differently about the world.
All right, Ross, I had you in here originally to talk about Greece, and I want to talk about Greece. We'll talk about this other stuff. Stay for a part two.
Fine.
But I want to talk here in this episode about Greece. Now, you've got this, the end game is approaching. We knew for years that the Greek economy was set up to fail. Now it's about to fail. There's going to be huge winners and huge losers. Those who made bets against the economy are going to make out like they made out against Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. I made the comment a while back that the predatory hedge funds who like to go after companies and destroy them and make money on like the subprime bet, the famous short
Big
bet,
Short,
the Big Short. Those folks went after Greece because they could. It was only a $200 to $300 billion economy, and the hedge fund industry has gotten so big that they can take out a country like Greece, and it looks like they've succeeded in destroying it. Is that a fair? What do you think?
That's a fair point. I think that what you've got to do, though, is go back. A lot of people forget that for Greece to get membership, Goldman hid their debt right back in the day. And you can't tell me that that didn't undermine democracy in Greece. That was really the starting point, to basically do a bit of shady accounting.
Sorry, I believe that there was something like 13 separate transactions that Goldman put together to make it look like Greece had less debt than they actually do, to forge their way into the euro.
So you ask a fundamental question, is that, should that be allowed? How do you regulate that? And how do you stop that? Because what everyone is talking about at the moment is triage. We're talking about the end game. What we should be doing is talking about the source problem or the root problem. And that, to me, Goldman acting in that way, it's not the first time they've undermined democracy.
Right. Well, I mean, you have four major banks in this country that are well known, and you have 2 or 3 major banks in the U.S. And there seems to be an overlap in the 4 biggest accounting firms in the world: KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, and there's a 4th one. And they're the ones who are the traffic directors in this global multi-trillion-dollar fraud.
You're right.
In other words, it's not even Goldman. Goldman's not even the source. We see it all the time with every single scandal. It's one of these 4 companies, accounting firms, where they didn't do their accounting.
This is what happens. This is what happens at the end of any economic cycle. Businesses that should be tertiary businesses have become primary drivers. So if you look at the UK now, estate agency, banking, accountancy, all these things that should be in third place and allow entrepreneurs, wealth creators, people who are birthing new ideas, they should be in prime position, in pole position, driving the economy forward. Small business too. What's happened, and what happens when an economy capsizes, is these guys become huge profit centres. And because they have such monopolies, they're able to milk basically everything. So you're squeezing both sides of the deal. And that's all that's happening. And a lot of people, want to jump to conspiratorial kind of aspect of this. There isn't any. It's what we call structurally determined. It's structurally determined economic behaviour because people are chasing those profits, and guess what? That's where they are.
Right. Osborne introduces Help to Buy with a 20% subsidy from the government, and the prices go up 20%.
Exactly.
And then people can't afford the prices, can't afford the houses.
But it's Help to Sell. It's not Help to Buy because people needed to liquidate because there's so much there are so many illiquid assets around at the moment, and that's proving to be a huge problem. And the second thing is everyone says claimant benefits or housing benefit in the UK. No, it's landlord benefit. And I think that we've got to reclaim the language here. Because if an economy has capsized, and I think that's certainly the case in Greece and across Europe, because in the most part because of property speculation, which is driven by credit, banks that are giving credit, and profiting hugely from that.
Okay, get the language back, but it comes back to the four big accounting firms. And when a major accounting firm, whether it's Ernst & Young, PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, when they say, and they look at a piece of paper with a bunch of numbers on it, and it has clearly a massive loss,
yes.
And then they put it forward to the regulators and to the world and say, this is a profit. And they do a bold-faced lie like this, and the government signs off on it, and Wall Street signs off on it, the City of London signs off on it. They have reinvented the language to make the loss. If this was Jesus Christ, they could start a whole religion based on it, turning water into wine. But they've turned losses into what they call profits.
That's a profit centre, excuse the pun, but if you start a religion, maybe we could do that. But
they have. It's the religion of fraud. KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, it's the religion of fraud.
They are not helping things.
All right. So
but I'll just say one thing on this: that my wife is a former banker and is a chartered accountant, and she left. Well, yeah, but she left.
Trouble.
On the day, soon after. There was pretty much a blackout on this when they were asked overnight to mark to model as opposed to mark to market.
Right. So just explain what that is. In other words, you've got books. Again, it's the language. It's use of language, Ross. You bring up a good point here. If you have on your books and you have securities that are underwater and are worth negative equity, they're junk, they're garbage, and you go to report your quarterly statements with the regulators, and instead of saying, well, to be honest, these securities are worth 2 pennies on the dollar, the new regulatory framework says, well, it's not about what they're actually worth.
Exactly.
It's about what they could be worth under certain circumstances, given parameters that we're going to make up on the back end, and therefore they're worth something different.
So it's changing the goalposts persistently in favour of the people who've got the monopoly. So she left, not in some kind of big, moral outrage, but just that she didn't want to be part of that. Because think of it: if you've been trained in that way and you've become a chartered accountant, everything that you've held dear and all the good practice overnight wiped out. Said that's it. We're just not going to adhere to that anymore. And she said, sorry, I don't want to be part of this.
Yeah, but that's just one instance of dozens and dozens and dozens of regulatory reframing and re-legislation and skullduggery.
But this is what happens when you come
to
to the end of an economic cycle, and that's exactly what's happening here in the UK. It's certainly what's happened in Greece. So it's a silly point. I'm reading a lot of the press at the moment about Greece, and are they going to exit? It's happened. There's no money left, and guess what? And as Michael Hudson says, and it's his mantra, a debt that can't be paid won't be. Which bit of that do we not get? You can't cheat natural law, but you think with a fiat currency where we can just print a load more, we can load more QE, reflate asset prices. Not going to work.
Yeah, but the end game for Greece is to have them give up all their assets.
Well,
They have income-producing assets. They have roads. They have toll booths. They have a port. They have institutions that they can be taken over by the likes of Germany, and they can put that on German balance sheet to help pay off, let's say, the derivatives debts of a Deutsche Bank, which isn't technically insolvent, but according to their regulator and their accountant, I'm sure whoever their accountant is at Deutsche Bank will say that company, that bank is solvent, and that's false. That's a lie. That's using the language inappropriately. That's a bold-faced, skulldugger's lie. They're not. They're insolvent.
I think you've landed that point. I think we've, and if not, those people who've got shaky tea somewhere in the home counties are just sitting now in a catatonic state.
Well, they don't. Well, let's talk about this last election, because the Tories won handily by Osborne giving away subsidies to the housing market and to the so-called shy Tory. The shy Tory is a rentier, help to buy, rent to buy, person who replaced all the council flats with another class of rentier class, so that there is no alternative. Margaret Thatcher, he ended up exactly where he started, with a bunch of aristocratic toffs ripping people off 24 hours a day. You got to hold on for a second part, if that's okay.
Good. Well,
okay.
I think you've set it up perfectly.
All right, perfect. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Ross Ashcroft of the Renegade Inc. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.